Welcome to the Third Rail Pod. We still don't have a tagline. We are the podcast without a tagline.
Taglines are for peasants.
Let's see. Anything interesting? Did we want to dive into my Joker thoughts at all? I know we talked about it before we started recording, which is always a good move, is to just say the interesting things you have to say off mic so that they're readily available on mic. It's a good strategy. For you youths out there that are looking to start a podcast, that's a good strategy.
Stop having interesting conversations without
just
a mic
mom's like, how was your day at work? No, save it for the podcast, Mom!
Kill me.
But
I mean, you already did your 2 hour.
I did a 2 hour take, yeah. And
my counterpoint to all of his stuff is that it was a nice movie, and Mason tends to get critical of things when he should try to enjoy them every once in a while.
There are 4 good movies.
There are 4 good movies. The Godfather Part 2, baby.
The Last Jedi and Empire Strikes Back. 4 good movies.
And Act 2.
And Act 2.
Wait a
minute. I suppose we'll make them I guess I just want to have on the record that if I forgot to say something bad about the movie, the fact that you did the Suicide Squad thing of on-the-nose song choices 30 times, that's obviously an exaggeration. It's because the movie is edited in an order that makes it impossible to remember. And if you want to know more about my thoughts of Joker, you're in luck, because there is an hour 50-minute podcast in which I do literally nothing but talk about... I made a solo, there are movies about, or there are podcasts about movies. I'm assuming somewhere there's some indie film that it's a movie about podcasts as well. But I don't think there are any, solo podcasts of people talk about the movie that's almost the length of the movie. The actual movie beat me by about 15 minutes.
So if you really want to, if you did not like Joker and you want to find out why.
No, actually, especially if you liked Joker, listen to the podcast, because I'll explain why you're wrong and your opinions suck. Because art is objective.
Hey now, we can't be doing movie snobbery. It's like music snobbery.
You know what's actually funny about me cracking that joke is this is maybe the worst opening ever. Me recalling the podcast to the other host of the podcast that probably will never listen to the solo pod, because he's already had to heard this rant, because it's a little bit more coherent version of the rant that I bombarded him with after we saw the movie together.
And you have continued to offer this rant for
2 more hours for the general public.
I mean, for the past week.
This is, you know why it is? Because I'm a slave. But I'm not a slave in, the traditional sense. I'm a slave to the content, baby! So...
Is this going to be the video game donkey episode?
Yeah.
Jesus.
So, let's just dive in. I think, so, on the docket, a little bit of a slow news day. I don't know, did anything important... I'm sure I'm forgetting something, or what'll happen is on the Tuesday before this always gets posted, because usually record Monday, and if I'm doing my job, it gets posted Wednesday. It's a lot easier. Most of the time I'll post it Wednesday from now on, ladies and gentlemen, because now that we have a recording place where we can record, we know it's going to be quiet enough that I don't have to edit the audio a whole lot. And it'll be enough of a quality where it's not 1080p. I just described 1080p for audio quality.
That makes total sense.
But it'll be enough of a quality to where I don't have to listen to the entire podcast and string together coherent thoughts out of muddied audio and bits where you can't hear what people are saying, and cut out bits where background music is too long. I basically have to edit out a fan noise and then just if skim through it, make sure I didn't say anything too outrageous, etc. So now these can come up in a timely manner. That's dope. So Wednesdays, you get to listen to the pods that were recorded on Monday, meaning if Trump tweets Tuesday, we World War III now, boys. This is me saying it's a slow news day is going to be what we in the industry call irony. So we're gonna dive into it's a story. So one of the fun things about this story is that like usually when we talk about something, it's like 2 weeks old. Like I think that's our signature move is like the talking about something that's like 2 weeks late to talk about. Like the Joker pod. I talked about it 2 weeks late because I didn't want to stay up till 4 a.m. recording a solo pod after I'd basically recorded a solo pod in public without a microphone.
Good job.
Or what else have we like I feel like that's just our signature. Hong Kong was like
Hong Kong's been going on for 19 weeks.
Well, no. But I mean, like
the Blizzard
we talked about the Blizzard and the NBA thing.
It was like a week late.
Well, it was like a week and a half late. The Ellen thing was probably the timeliest thing we've done prior to today. That was maybe a week late. So as you know, we're real good at talking about this stuff
after the fact.
After the fact, but we're gonna dive into something that's like maybe 3 days old. Now the downside is because this is a niche story, we have to explain the story to people because you know less of our audience, frankly, is gonna know who we're talking about, any of the characters of this story. Whereas like the NBA story, the Helen story, people, even if they don't know literally everything that happened, can quickly, you know, you can do the Wikipedia 2-sentence summary thing. So, essentially what happens is ContraPoints, who is, but it's fair to say I wouldn't say the biggest trans YouTuber because there's like sort of more like, personal life driven or like fashion. I don't want to say fashion driven because it's not all like RuPaul stuff, but like basically like non-vlogger YouTuber.
She's one of like 2 or 3 political trans YouTubers, and probably the biggest of them.
Oh yeah, if you're going like super specific, like if we're adding the qualifier political, by far the biggest. Well, like someone who in the sphere of public discourse about the political issues of the left, particularly those of trans issues. Someone who has had a voice that has really almost leaked into the mainstream in some ways. Like, this is someone with, like, a gold YouTube play button, and that's no small thing. Or what's the $1 million one? Million subscriber one.
I think that might be gold. I don't know.
There's a gold. I think gold is 1 million, and I think the diamond one is 10 million. And the diamond one is like for basically the Logan Paul. Like basically, you have to be real big time to get 10 million.
I mean, she's at 752,000.
Okay, so she's not gold tier status. Fucking fake and lame. So, that was a joke, by the way. So, anyway, she put out a video, and so her videos are basically long video essays. Kind of, I've dipped my toe in a little bit of it. It'd be kind of. It's eventually super structured, super sort of high production value, light theatrical elements, video essays. So it's basically like if your philosopher teacher dressed up as like drag queen characters.
Not even necessarily that, but just dressed up in theater.
No, but her sense of fashion, not like all of her outfits, but most of her outfits I think are. Like, there's some characters of ContraPoints that are, like Tabby the Cat and Tiffany Tumbles, who are not in the Contra-verse.
Contra-verse.
There are a couple characters, but, like, I would say 80% of the characters are influenced by the style of, like, RuPaul's drag queens. Like, the, Mistress of the Night and, like, the Opulence character and the Marilyn Monroe-ish character, like I would say most of them are have varying degrees of influence by the drag culture.
I believe the word she used is naive camp.
Yeah. Well, this video that we're talking about kind of digs into that stuff specifically. But now we're getting sort of off the rail of like the important. Okay, it doesn't really matter which. Basically, it's like super sort of theatrical stylized, super duper high production value video essays about really deep philosophical. It's a really deep dive philosophical, like master's level. I think because she said she has a master's degree in philosophy, right?
Either that or
I think she dropped out before she got her PhD.
Yeah,
because she was like, maybe I don't, because the PhD program is the thing of nightmares. But
PhD programs are for people who hate themselves?
More or less, unless you're like a doctor and then you don't have a choice.
Well, then it's not a PhD, it's an MD. But that's a different split hair, so don't worry.
Okay, so basically she posts a video and the topic of the video doesn't even necessarily matter to like the greater degree. Like basically what we're discussing is that in her video, so something that's kind of been popular with YouTube video essays in general, and we're digging into like, again, weird Mason and Joel niche stuff.
Colloquially known as BreadTube, it's common practice for a YouTuber to approach a fellow YouTuber to do a voiceover of a literature quote that they're using for their video essay. So, for instance, Ollie Thorne made a video making fun of Julius Evola, famed fascist, Nazi, etc., and he asked some of his compatriots, including H-Bomber Guy and Folding Ideas, to read quotes from him, and ContraPoints also read quotes from Julius Evola to drive home points in his video essay.
So essentially, it's like the normie YouTube equivalent of like Shane Dawson showing up in a Jake Paul video, right?
It's like a cameo.
It's that, but it's not as much of it. So whereas like the premise of a Logan Paul video may be like, oh, this is the first time I've met Shane Dawson, but this is not that. It's like a mild version of that where it's basically what it is a flex. It's like, oh, these people are and a lot of them have come out and publicly. This will actually become relevant here in a little bit, but so this group of people who are kind of loosely connected, but basically people who have been vocally outspoken, some of whose content centers around leftist political ideology and arguments in favor of that, and some of whom are simply friends with these people, have semi-related content where it's not really mostly the other sort of unrelated people. It's like videos about media, whether that be like video games or movies or books or whatever, but like sort of there's sort of, it's basically you have the people who like literally talk about leftist issues, and then you have what I call like the BreadTube extended family, like people who are in that friend group,
who are associated, and
will sometimes also feature on the videos of the political variety. So this, and it's not an official thing, but it's not a thing like. I feel like one of my critiques of that group is like they try to have it both ways, where publicly they basically denounce the idea that it is a group that exists, that is a coalition, but at the same time, like when they are constantly putting each other in their videos to do small cameos, and it's consistently the same nebula of people.
Yeah, it's like 4 or 5 different people.
And there's not necessarily a whole lot of variance outside of that group, then you are sort of constructing for your audience the idea that there is a network of some kind. And so acknowledging that network and putting a label on it is just sort of acknowledging reality. Whether you may not have made a breadtube.com website or done like the BreadTube Alliance subscription or whatever.
Yeah, you don't.
Which is essentially their argument that like, no, this is not that. But my argument against that would be like, no, but like clearly you people have figured out that like the algorithm has tied us together, and we're already kind of, maybe they were friends before, maybe they were friends later when they realized like, oh yeah, I really like your content or whatever. But like clearly people, they have used the fact that both the YouTube algorithm and their own just sort of personal friend networks have connected them in such a way, and they have used that to further their content, which is 100% totally fine. I'm all on board with, because the YouTube algorithm and them featuring each other's videos is kind of how I found these videos. So that's 100% fine. I found these other videos by following the first videos, and then following like, oh, that's an interesting video title. I click on it. Some of them I like. I would say most of them I like, some of them I don't like, and that's totally fine. So it's a real mild critique, which is just like, it's okay to say that the thing exists, that you have, I kind of wish there maybe a little bit more acknowledgement of the thing that exists. But now we are getting way off track. So the controversy has basically nothing to do with that, and it's essentially that ContraPoints, the person that we're discussing, had Buck Angel on her video to do one of these voiceovers. And
I guess we need to get into ContraPoint's philosophy about...
We'll get to that in a moment. We're going to explain what Buck Angel is. So Buck Angel is a trans man who has viewpoints about the trans identity and of non-binary gender identity that a lot of people on the left are not happy about. And I will, for now, just say those basically the two main viewpoints which cause beef without comment or discussion for now. Viewpoint number one that people find reprehensible is that he essentially rejects the idea of non-binary as a valid gender identity. Like, his viewpoint is basically, you have to be one or the other. And he hasn't necessarily said, like, men can't wear a dress or whatever. He's not one of those people, but he said, like, you are still one of these things or the other. And then the other thing, which I think the two things are essentially interconnected, is his idea of gender identity is that you are a woman until you get the male transition surgery, or vice versa. You are still a female you're still a male until you get the female transitional surgery.
Which I think even defining it that way is a little...
That's how he defines it.
Yeah, which is like... The way it's phrased right now, I don't necessarily disagree with, because, like, there's a fundamental difference between gender and sex, right?
Right, but, like, he is saying they're, like...
So what he's going for is... The problem is he is
equating gender to sex,
essentially. Yeah, Buck Angel is equivocating gender identity with sexual traits.
Yeah, because, like, even with, like, sex traits, right, you have, like, people with multiple chromosomes, and people with... I mean, there are a lot of different sort of chromosomal disorders that wouldn't fall into the two sexes, strictly speaking.
Well, I mean, and sexes don't even necessarily matter because, men can be feminine and women can be masculine, and so it's not useful as a gender marker.
Right, outside of, specific medical contexts that are between you and your doctor.
If you do or don't have ovaries or something. That's about all.
Or if you're like Mason and you just constantly discuss your genitalia and lack thereof uses.
Oh yeah, that's right. You got your balls cut off. I forgot.
Yeah, we'll go with that. So that is the controversy in short. And so people are mad at her, and she's been #canceled by... I want to say, because gay Twitter is too broad, right? Like, this is, like even probably, trans Twitter. So...
Well, yeah, and the weird thing is the philosophy that ContraPoints has presented at large is antithetical to Buck Angel.
Right, so in a different, non-Buck Angel related video, essentially the viewpoint that she, in her most sort of trans-centric video that she's presented, which I believe she says this in the Our Traps Gay video.
Yeah, Our Traps Gay, the video.
And traps refers to basically men who look like women, who it's sort of a incredibly sexist, vile term that people use to basically be make fun of.
I mean, she suggests that it's a slur, which I'm not necessarily against.
But essentially, her argument in that video is ultimately, gender, not sex, like we discussed, but gender identity is simply a matter of fashion expression. Because
performative, yeah.
Yeah, it is inherently performative because essentially if sex is sex and that's a totally separate category, like I said, and even that is not strictly binary because of various medical conditions that would put you somewhere in the middle. But
Yeah. So...
But as far as gender identity is concerned, you can't necessarily say that someone is strictly male as a gender identity or strictly female as a gender identity, and because like you can't say like, oh well, if you have short hair that makes you a man. The gender identity at that point becomes strictly a performative statement and simply you say therefore you am.
Yeah, and that's...
Therefore you am. Let me try that again.
Therefore you are?
Yeah. That is essentially the stance that she has presented on her YouTube channel. And
I mean, I think the reasoning needs to be sound, because otherwise,
right, but I think the reasoning is sound, because she goes, and I don't want to like do an entire recap of an unrelated video. So basically she knocks out like, well, you can't define gender like this. So, like, one of the things is you can't simply define gender as, like, what you are biologically. But, so the example she uses is parentage. So, like, if you adopt a child, people don't, like, basically try to, like, say, like, oh, well, you're not a real parent because you've adopted it and didn't shove this
Well,
flesh.
Some people do, but they're assholes.
Right, like, no one in the general public is like, oh, well, you're not a real parent because you adopted, because you didn't shove this flesh thing out of your vagina.
Yeah,
so...
You're a parent because you are going through the performative
within certain medical contexts that it's important, like if you're looking at a child's medical history or something along those lines. But outside of those specific medical contexts, we can say that the child, that the two parents pairs or singular parent pair,
the parent or parents are the parents. Period.
Parents within every sort of reasonable, practical context, similar to how she's saying, and basically she goes through several other metaphors, but essentially that's the same conclusion that she draws as like what we should use is kind of a guideline for gender identities. That is her viewpoint that she's discussed. But other people are set that someone else who's discussed other viewpoints that are #problematic.
Guest starred on one of the videos.
And one thing that is important to note before we get into sort of the philosophical discussion of this is he does not express that viewpoint on the video.
Yeah, no.
His role in the video is to read a single, and I actually don't know which one was him, because I didn't realize this is a controversy until like later. I woke up, I saw on Twitter like 2 days later, like everyone's pissed at her. I was like, oh, that's weird.
Well, I don't know. Everybody being pissed at ContraPoints on Twitter seems to be a pretty normal thing.
Yeah. But people are, the people are, so he basically, his quote is, he literally just reads a quote, basically like a source citation that she's using, basically it would be like in a real research essay, it would essentially be what would be a footnote.
Yeah.
But it's, in the video essay format, it's a guest star reading the quote of that footnote.
Yep.
That is what he does. He does not express any views of any kind, either in her favor or against her favor. However, that the fact that he is in that video, given, and that's why sort of the general breadtube explanation was semi-necessary, because if you are on the video and all the other people who are tangibly kind of unspoken to be within a certain social group, then the unspoken suggestion is that that person, while not necessarily being in that group, has some sort of soft endorsement from a member of that group.
Yeah, it's really weird. I mean, I just thought of this comparison. It's like a gay YouTuber having a voiceover from somebody who says, quote, they support the life, they believe it's a choice and they respect that choice.
What do you mean?
Like, if a gay YouTuber...
The choice of what?
Of being gay. Like, It's like a gay YouTuber having a guest star or a voiceover from somebody who...
Oh, gotcha. When I hear the word choice, I just think of abortion. And I was like, what does abortion have to do with gay rights?
Yeah, no, like, it's like a gay YouTuber has a voiceover from somebody who's like, I believe that being gay is a choice, and I support that choice. Like, it's not.
Yeah, I think that's roughly the equivalent.
It's not overtly anti-gay people, or in this case, anti-trans people, but it is.
This one's a
regressive.
little that's not perfect because the difference is in theory, like Buck Angel is basically denying the right to exist to a certain fragment of that community versus like your example, like it's like that actually. So the better example of this would be like a gay rights activist was on another gay YouTuber's video, but that the problematic gay rights activist didn't think that like bisexual was a valid identity.
Oh yeah, bisexual people just want attention and are greedy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's totally it.
So that would be the equivalent. Now there are a couple things that we have to consider. One is that people, so first of all, like, what's the worst thing you can, like, what is the worst crime you can commit before you are hashtag canceled or hashtag cut off? Okay?
So, like, what's the line?
Okay, yeah, what's the line? How long ago does your crime have to be? I'm sure if I dug through my every single thing that I said on Sherwood Dungeon when I was a 15-year-old douchebagger,
edgelord,
I'm sure I would be very displeased. Now, luckily for me,
I distinctly remember discussing whether or not fag was a bad word in the Old Republic in a chat in the middle of a flashpoint.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, there's some not good shit that I've said, I'm sure.
Yeah, so first, now that's not necessarily the best example because this is something she did weeks ago and posted a few days ago, versus that was a while ago. But that is kind of one of the elements we look at. So let's say that someone is against Medicare for all. So am I going to... Now, if you take the literal worst interpretation of that individual's views, they're like,
fundamentally...
they're pro, like, murdering diabetic people.
Yeah, they think that poor sick people should die.
Yeah.
That's the least charitable stance.
Now, if they're, let's just say a semi-centrist Democrat who thinks, like, essentially a tweaked version of Obamacare is the solution, well, then are they just an uneducated doofus? What if you find out that they have a cousin with diabetes that they care about? Does that make them actually secretly hate their cousin? Well, no. At a certain point, we just have to, understand that none of us have all the answers.
Except me.
Except Joel. And we shouldn't... I think we're in a dangerous place, and I'm certainly no saint when it comes to this. As anyone who has listened to me talk ever, I'm certainly no saint when it comes to being maybe overly assertive with their viewpoints. See the Joker pod. But we as a society, we as individuals, it would be a better way to say it, need to be better about being skeptical of our own ideas. And I think the more that you can become skeptical of your own ideas, the wider a net you can cast when it comes to, like, talking to people.
I mean, sure, but at what point do I have to be skeptical of my own ideas? Like, I think I would find it hard to, to be like, I don't know, when it comes to whether or not people have the right to medical care.
Well, so here's where I would say, so there's a difference between skeptical of your ideas and having no conviction in your ideas. So skepticism is simply the idea that you are constantly re-examining your viewpoints and trying to figure out, like, okay, where is this viewpoint wrong? Where is this viewpoint be improved? So, like, use the medical thing.
You know what we call that? Rationality.
I feel, to some degree, I feel like I'm almost I'm just like, this is how beliefs work.
Like, I mean,
but sometimes obvious shit just has to be said. Like people want you to just be like, when it comes to like, to me, where I sort of draw the line with this situation specifically is like, this individual, Buck Angel, did not share those viewpoints on this video. Now, do I think that ContraPoints,
is softly endorsing his viewpoints by featuring him?
No. I don't think that at all, because I think her own viewpoints have made it crystal. Like in this specific situation, because that's why I brought up the fact that in another video, she, in distinct, clear detail, spends most of the video constructing an extremely concise explanation of what her view is on the situation.
Concise is generous, but yeah.
Or
it's like a 40-minute video.
Yeah. Concise, no.
It's very precise. It is precise.
I think that's probably the word I should have used.
It's very exacting. There's no mistaking exactly.
You know exactly what she believes, and you know why she believes it.
Yeah, and it's, in my opinion, it's very well defended and makes sense. And I really can't comment on it because this is an experience that I'm not going through. So.
As you said, I chopped off my balls, so I'm getting there.
You're getting there? No, I thought you were just going to turn into Varys. Can we shave your head?
Hell yeah.
Let's do it.
Yo, my hair is so long. I probably just need to shave it.
You need to get a goddamn haircut. I got a haircut before you did. My hair was shorter than yours.
What? Oh, yeah, your hair's shorter than mine.
Yeah, I said
shorter than mine.
I got a haircut before you did, and my hair was shorter than yours before I got the haircut.
Hell yeah. So, to bring this back on topic.
Topics.
I like how, discussing my haircut's great radio.
Fuck your hair.
But yeah, my point is, so if you've made your views, incredibly, I don't think her views could be any more clear unless she, had it tattooed on her forehead.
I mean, yeah.
Just the entire script of the 40-minute video.
I think
Braille.
I think a lot of the problems that people take with her including him on her video is that it's tacitly endorsing his viewpoints, even if...
Because so let's go ahead and just tie it into the larger picture that we kind of mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah.
So this is like the Ellen Bush thing reduxed.
Yes.
Now there are certain elements that are different because, the context in which Buck Angel is on the video is political, maybe not necessarily to his stance, but it's
relevant.
Them talking about how the kids are doing and how Aaron Rodgers can throw the ball far.
Yeah. It's strictly about,
business. It is within the context of what she believes specifically, which then by definition extends somewhat to the context of what he believes.
Yeah, it pertains directly to what he believes. And so, even if she's explicitly stated belief, I guess the question then becomes, is allowing somebody who is directly contradictory to that to be on your video, is that tacitly either conceding or endorsing to their ideology by giving them a platform, by even letting them have their voice in your video? Because then that says that you associate with each other. And if you associate with each other, in a business sense, in a political sense, I mean, am I not supposed to scratch my head if Ocasio-Cortez has Joe Biden feature on her political commentaries? Sure, Joe Biden's on the left, but he's, by most standards, a little center-right of the rest of the world.
Yeah, so that's a little bit different because, inherently, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has to somewhat endure, her job, by definition, she has to be on the same side
As Joe Biden. Yeah, that's fair.
Joe Biden. Like, they will vote on 95% of the same things.
Yeah, and I guess that's fair because he has to. Okay, so...
Like, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez may not be happy about Obamacare, but she will still support Obamacare because
it's better
it is an
than the
improvement
alternative
over the current Republican position.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see if I can think of an accurate comparison here.
So I want to, unless you come up with, just stop me if you think of
just
something.
Go.
So here's one thing that I don't think anyone's brought up. Isn't this also Buck Angel endorsing her viewpoints
by choosing to? That's actually a really good point.
Because this is not the context of, say, what people always compare this to is like, you know, talk show X allows, you know, who's the conspiracy theorist? Alex Jones.
Oh, Joe Rogan.
So, like, Joe Rogan has Alex Jones on the podcast,
and makes fun of him, like, the entire time.
But the difference is that, like, the Joe Rogan podcast...
The Joe Rogan experience.
Joe Rogan podcast does not really explicitly have much of a political ideology, if anything. It has a couple of things that it kind of, like, basically, like, fat girls are ugly, and short hair is bad. Like, those are about the only two political stances that Joe... And, like, steroids are cool.
Oh, and marijuana is cool.
And marijuana is cool. Those are, like, the four things that... Like, it is... I don't want to say it's completely devoid of political lean.
He is. Well, I don't know. I think he also has...
He himself is clearly not, because he had a stand-up special called Triggered. And it's one of the worst fucking things I've ever seen.
I think he's also explicitly... Well, not explicitly, but he is definitely way more anti-trans and way more willing to entertain conservative thought than leftist thought, because compared to a lot of conservative people that he's had on there when...
To be frank, also, I think conservatives have just been more willing to go to other platforms.
Yeah.
Like, really... This is the first election cycle that we've really seen any presidential candidates leave the extremely explicit circles of Sunday morning with Joe Scarborough, or who's the CBS guy. Those are the two big ones.
I don't fucking know.
Anyway, basically the Sunday morning shows. This is really the first election cycle which we've actually... People could say, like, oh yeah, Obama's campaign was super viral, but Obama never really...
He didn't get on YouTube and talk on podcasts, you know.
No, he never left, during his 4 campaigns, he never left the parameters of these, basically, Sunday morning shows,
of TV.
Debates, and, like, town hall meetings. He never left that incredibly narrow sort of, here is the game plan of how we do things. And where he innovated was more just in, like, how he ran his ad campaigns and how he mobilized grassroots movements. Versus...
And now we have Andrew Yang doing AMAs, like, every other month on Reddit.
Yeah, like, Obama started that a little bit as a president.
Well, yeah. Like, it's not
like, he did a YouTube video. He did, like, the stuff with he was promoting healthcare.gov. He did several things. He was on Between Two Ferns. He was on several late-night shows.
As president, though, but as a campaign. Like, and I think, that's definitely changing.
Like, Rogan has had, like, even to use, like, the literal example, Joe Rogan has had several of the current Democratic candidates on. He had Sanders on, he had Harris on, I think he had Buttigieg on.
Buttigieg.
I think Beto.
Beto, my boy.
Which I learned it's pronounced Beto.
Beto? Really?
Yeah, okay. Which I learned because I heard Beto on the Bill Simmons podcast, you know, and like you said, Reddit AMAs, it seems like every single candidate now, except for like the super duper, like, extremely, like, basically out of touch establishment, like Biden hasn't got on any pods, you know, and this all sort of started with like so the Pod Save America pod is kind of, it was kind of the first podcast to really break into the political sphere. And it's done a lot of, like, mobilization when it comes to voter turnout for the Democrat Party. It's basically these former Obama staffers. They originally had a podcast that was part of the Ringer Network, which is like a sports pop culture website. And it was supposed to be kind of a one-time, it was like a one-off for the 2016 election. Then Trump won, and they're like, oh, this is a disaster. We should break off and do our own thing and just keep things going. And now they have their pod Save America, and they have a whole, the Crooked Media. It's basically a whole thing where it's basically become like sort of, it's the closest equivalent we have to Fox News. And people can say like, Chapo Trap House is the other one, but it's more like the not that I'm comparing I'm not saying like Chapo Trap House is like Breitbart in the sense that like it's bad but unfactual. But if we're going strictly from like a spectrum and audience reach equivalent, that would be like the Chapo Trap House. What do you actually call the pod?
Isn't it just Chapo Trap House?
Yeah, just Chapo Trap House.
Isn't that what it is?
Yeah. So, anyways, Chapo is the like basically like the like we're starting to see like the genesis of a left-leaning media structure similar to what Fox News, Breitbart, and all these things that have been around really since the 80s.
Yeah, and it's really funny because I can't believe this is what it took for any, non-blind leftist to see that Fox News has more or less become like the propaganda arm of the GOP, and if they want their own microphone, they're going to have to build one.
Yeah. Now, why was I talking about all that? Right. So my point... let's rewind a little bit. My original point is that with that kind of context, right? Like, Rogan... Like them going on those type of shows, they're not necessarily endorsing it in the same way that Buck Angel can be interpreted as endorsing it, because like the Joe Rogan pod does not necessarily have an explicit political statement. There are a couple of things that like Rogan personally has expressed as political opinions, but it is not like really like it's not an inherently, for all the people talk about like Joe Rogan being like part of like the alt-right pipeline on the internet.
Yeah,
like,
I mean, the insinuation
the Joe Rogan podcast is not really a political podcast, okay? The vast majority of guests on the Joe Rogan podcast, the vast majority of content on the Joe Rogan podcast is something that it's not explicitly political. A lot of athletes go on that podcast. They have like scientists on that podcast, pretty far out there stuff. They have writers on that podcast. Like, really everyone you could think of has... When I say everyone, I just mean everyone is in, like, types of different people. Yeah. Famous people, unfamous people, scientists, interesting... One thing that I think that I have plenty of critiques about the Joe Rogan podcast, but...
He can pull
one thing I will give it credit for is that it has an incredibly interesting, diverse cast of guests that is basically unmatched. As far as just like the variety that you would get episode to episode on that podcast. Now, versus like, we'll go ahead and just go to make what I talked about semi-relevant, when Kamala Harris or Beto O'Rourke go on to the Pod Save America podcast, which does have an explicitly stated political lean, that is an endorsement. And we can get into sort of the, certain left pundits being willing to show up on Fox News, and how that kind of is semi-tangibly related to this. But my point is, if something has a political view, then sort of going on it is leaning at least a certain legitimacy. Yeah. I would say you're not necessarily, so this is how it ties in. I finally figured out the point I'm trying to communicate. So if we look at mainstream politics, right? By showing up to something, you are not endorsing it, but you are lending it a certain legitimacy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And by the person booking you on that show,
they are lending you legitimacy.
They are likewise lending you a certain level of legitimacy. Yeah. That is essentially what's happening with ContraPoints. Buck Angel, by showing up on there, is lending the ContraPoints channel a certain small helping of legitimacy
from
among certain communities that may not necessarily endorse her. Versus, likewise, what people are upset about is she is also lending him a certain level of legitimacy. And I think the problem is that people on Twitter, non-binary people in general who feel deeply offended by these views,
feel that there should be no legitimacy lended whatsoever.
Right. And this is almost what it ties into the Ellen thing. It's like, people are mad about the Ellen thing because they're like, Bush shouldn't be legitimate. Every single person who interacts with Bush should be like, what's up, motherfucking war criminal? Now, the difference is that I explicitly disagree with the assertion that, like, Ellen simply talking to a man at a football game lends some legitimacy. This is different because it is within a context that is explicitly political. That's a long explanation. Do you have anything you'd like to add to that so I can save my voice?
I mean, yeah, obviously the contexts are different. There's not much to add. You pretty much covered it all. And I mean, to be honest, the only reason that I was aware of this controversy is because I came across, we were discussing some Taylor Swift shit that I don't even know what happened yet still, because I was distracted by this thing that I came across on Out of the Loop. So, yeah. That's
and
all.
So here...
Oh, yeah, and people are mad at, like, Philosophy Tube or something as well, because, like, he's...
So, let me tie that in. This is where I think it gets absolutely fucking ridiculous. So, I think we can have a serious discussion of whether you should allow people a platform that you disagree with. That is one of the most complicated questions of our time that we are going to have to grapple with.
Yeah, because
when should people be allowed to have a platform? Because both things can be true. Nazis shouldn't be allowed to have platforms, but at the same time, we can't just keep using the term deplatforming to talk around the fact that what we're really talking about is censorship. That is what we're talking about. There's no way to... Deplatforming is just censorship with better PR. That is what that term means.
I mean, sure, but at the same time, is it really? I mean... these are YouTube, Google, Facebook, Twitter, fucking...
Well, okay, so let's...
Hang on. Instagram. All of these are corporate entities in the capitalist system that are not beholden to government laws. They're not beholden to the idea that censorship is something that they have to respect and not enforce, because everybody has a right to free speech. Oh, Reddit. I forgot Reddit. Because, there's this... These entities don't exist outside of the capitalist system, because they're there to make a profit. And if they find that your rhetoric is so damaging to their image that they cannot host you anymore, I think that when Alex Jones is getting banned from YouTube, I'm like, yeah, that's a logical conclusion. Not necessarily because, conservative ideology deserves to be censored, and we can discuss that later, but it's because Alex Jones actively pushes bullshit conspiracy theories that are dangerous.
Right. So here's the problem with that, though. This is why this is maybe... Global warming is the most difficult problem of our time from, a practical standpoint, just because there are so many hurdles as far as, here are all the things we have to overcome to fix climate change.
Uh-huh.
But the actual, what we should do to fix it is actually, finding the solution is simple. It is simply basically coercing society, the global community as a whole, into enacting these changes. That is the difficult part. But there's really no debate on how we should fix the issue. This issue is, I think, the most difficult issue in society right now, as far as how do we come to a way to fix this issue? So you say all those things. Now, if I am in charge of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, okay, every single person in charge of these is filthy rich, and to be frank, all of them are white. Every single one.
I actually don't know if that's true.
All the owners of these places are white. I know Jack from Twitter is white. I know the Reddit guy is white. The two Google folks who run YouTube are white.
Asian. Who? I thought it was an Asian chick that ran Reddit. It doesn't matter.
No, the main guy who runs Reddit, who's now like engaged to Serena Williams, he's white. He's the main owner of Reddit.
Oh, okay.
There can be other people. I'm talking like the sort of figurehead primary owner types, right? Because there are two. Isn't there a Hispanic guy that was one of the main guys of Facebook? But he's not who you think of. You think of Zuckerberg. My point is, all these people are really rich, and they're all white, and I believe they're all males.
Yeah. Okay. So what are we getting at here?
Right. So, what is their viewpoint on the world? I don't think I need to spell this out. All right. There are going to be people who lean at best in a sort of Silicon Valley sort of faux representative neoliberalism. So there's a very specific sort of like Silicon Valley type hyper capitalist sort of philosophy that, interesting enough, I actually don't think really has any political representation. And it'll be interesting to see what happens because these guys have so much money now. I think we're going to start seeing people who are like basically like girl boss politics, for lack of a better term. Like basically girl boss politicians. Where it's like, I'm all for representation as long as you strip yourself of identity and just behave exactly like these white super venture capitalist Mitt Romney type sort of leeches on the economy as a whole. So my point is, like, it's all fine and dandy to say, like, yes, these people, like Alex Jones, yes, we can justify taking him off because his free speech is not protected on YouTube because it affects their bottom line. Well, it's not that much of a stretch for anyone in charge of any of these companies to just simply say anyone who leans anything left of Joe Biden is a threat to their bottom line because their platform is being used to put out ideology that would cause their taxes to go up, that would cause their industries to become more regulated, and all these other things that make it much more difficult. Frankly, to be frank, it costs them money.
Okay, yeah, that's
and
fair.
What happens if tomorrow Twitter, they don't even have to announce it. They can just change the algorithm to make sure that like nothing left of center ever goes viral on their platform.
Okay, I mean...
And it'll take, if they do that tomorrow, it will take months before anyone notices.
So what?
And also, it'll probably take them months to get it the way they want it. But because they have to use machine learning, they don't really understand how their own algorithms work, which is an interesting discussion for maybe a little bit later.
Yeah, because I don't understand.
I'll explain that in a second. So, one of the interesting things about updating all these algorithms, you can't simply say, well, do more of this, this, and this. The way these machines, because all these algorithms like Twitter, YouTube, they're so complex that like no one at these companies understand how they work. They basically, what they do is they feed examples into these algorithms, or like, this is what we want more of, this is what we want less of, and then over time the algorithm learns what's a good result and what's a bad result by the human feeding it, saying like, oh, you messed up here.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. I guess to reach back to the original point,
well,
are we really suggesting that it's an all or nothing scenario where we have to entertain the Alex Joneses of the world on a public media platform in order to also publish correct information?
Right, so is that the line we're drawing then? Is it's like simply like the factual correctness? Because like, sure, by that definition you can take Alex Jones off, but can you take Richard Spencer off?
Or even Jordan Peterson, for that matter, because Jordan Peterson is really, 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 really good at making non-controversial statements and then implying something else entirely. You know.
Right, well, let's not even get into the Jordan Peterson things. I think most people would, regardless of like the fact that
Isn't Richard Spencer a renowned Nazi?
Richard Spencer is literally a Nazi.
Yeah,
that's
his
girlfriend has a giant swastika right above her her tits.
Okay, so I mean, what is he posted on? I mean,
basically, like, there's no way to be more of a Nazi than Richard Spencer.
But the thing is like, does the content he posts on YouTube, etc., is it objectively wrong? Is he suggesting that black people are innately inferior?
Yes, he is. But here's the problem: we're not the ones making these decisions. It's these corporate entities that are making these decisions. So this is where it becomes complicated because, all right, like it or not, all of these platforms have become public utilities.
I mean, sure.
And at the same time, similar to kind of what we were talking about with why fixing how news media works is so complicated, is because if we give the government control of all this stuff, it's pretty obvious where that can go wrong. See China.
Yeah, let's just give them control of the internet. That's a good idea. I guess looking at the habits of YouTube, like, they banned Alex Jones. They haven't banned the golden one yet. Is it just because he's not big enough to draw the ire of the internet, or what?
So essentially what all these platforms to various levels of success have landed on is that they will allow it up to a certain point. That certain point is a combination of the actual content of the user, the influence of the user, how much money that user makes that platform, and the public outrage that user generates. It's almost sort of a formula where, like, Logan Paul is an example. Okay, they left Logan Paul's video up there for a couple of days because Logan Paul, as one of their biggest stars, is given, frankly, a lot more leeway than pretty much anyone else on this platform is allowed to do. But the outrage got to such a degree that they took it off several hours after the fact, because at a certain point, the level of outrage and bad press outweighed the relatively small amount of money that they lost by properly punishing Logan Paul so the first thing they did, they left the video up there for quite a while, like much longer than the Suicide Forest video should have been. Then they took it down, but then they're like, they didn't punish Logan Paul at all. Like, he was allowed to keep all his videos monetized, even though, like, literally, like, pretty much no other human being on the platform would be allowed to get away with that. And YouTube's kind of a weird example because, like you can't monetize Twitter. You can have your Venmo in Twitter or have, like, a Patreon page where, like, essentially you sort of bypass your inability to monetize it. But
yeah, or you get sponsorships.
But YouTube's a little bit different because, like, it has a monetization where, like, there are basically different levels that it can punish. It can punish you different degrees in the way a legal system can versus, like, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit can there's really only two things they can do to punish you. They can ban you for a short amount of time, or they can ban you forever.
Or IP ban you.
Or, like, I believe Twitter has, like, a mute function where you can still use your account, but you can't post for X amount of time. But essentially, they're all basically short or long variations of the same punishment.
Yeah, whereas YouTube actually has the money thing going on.
Yeah. So essentially, like, that is sort of the decision-making apparatus that all these platforms follow. So, like, one of the things that has become, in the zeitgeist is, like, one of the worst discussions now that is just kind of mainstream is, like, should Twitter ban Donald Trump? Because objectively speaking, Donald Trump has broken every single one of their terms and conditions many times over. Now, there are several realities that they have to deal with that situation. One, every Twitter user constantly breaks all of their rules. And if you have a following of more than 1,000 people, you're going to get away with it. Meanwhile, little old my account gets fucking banned because the algorithm picks up the word, I think, kill. I'm sure I tweeted something real bad. I don't want to get into details. But, like, I've been muted on Twitter, like, 3 times because the algorithm catches me versus, like, these larger Twitter accounts tend not to get banned.
Because they drive traffic.
Yeah. 2, Donald Trump is a political figure. And people can say, well, simply treat the political... Like,
political figures like...
We're way past the point of simply refusing to acknowledge the political figure as legitimate. Like, we could have a whole other separate discussion of, like, well, maybe if Twitter had done this from square one and simply banned him from Twitter, then we wouldn't be in this mess. Like, you could construct an argument that Twitter is single-handedly responsible for the Trump presidency. That if they had deplatformed him for his violations of their terms of service...
Like, 20 years ago?
That, or even like, you know, pre-Trump having real polling numbers in Iowa, that they could have ended the whole thing right there. Now, the reverse effect is like people tend not to use these. One of the more interesting things is that people tend not to use the Streisand effect argument for rightly. It's like always liberal people that get the Streisand effect. They're like, oh, we're banning person X for saying gay rights are real cool. Hashtag Streisand effect. Which I don't want to, like, recap my entire, like, episode 1 be explaining why the Streisand effect is, like, not really real, but rather it's sort of, once in a while these things backfire, but most of the times they work exactly the way they wanted to, and you don't hear about it, because these censorship actions work exactly the way they wanted them to. But there is an argument, particularly with Donald Trump, that I think holds a little more water, that if Twitter all of a sudden starts banning Trump, that someone somewhere, like at a certain point, because Trump is a billionaire, he will get his message out there with or without. Like, the problem with trying to censor Donald Trump is that you cannot censor a billionaire.
You also cannot censor the president of the United States.
Well, no. I'm talking, like, even if they're, like, way pre-president. I'm saying, like, I'm talking more now about a theoretical of, like, if we deplatformed Donald Trump before the Iowa primary.
In 2014, or even before that, when he was still posting anti-vax bullshit.
Yeah. So, alright, so Donald Trump, like, you can't, like, it is essentially impossible to, I should say essentially, it is literally impossible to censor a billionaire, alright? So, like, if you're going to argue the Streisand effect would happen...
It would happen big time.
It would... This is why I think it happened to the literal Barbara Streisand, because she is someone who's wealthy and influential.
And so
when you are wealthy and influential, then it is much harder for someone to silence your voice. And Trump, I think, more than any other politician in human history, cannot be silenced, because he has such a cult following that if he what are we gonna do if he tomorrow should go, like, let's say he gets fucking banned from Twitter, banned from Facebook, banned from YouTube. Like, let's just imagine a perfect. This is getting to the point where, like, already it's like such a fucking unrealistic thing to say he would simply get banned from every social media platform all at once before he became a significant political figure. But let's say that happens, right? Now, you know, because he's a billionaire and he's already one of the most famous people on Earth, okay? Like, if I'm a news organization and it's like, oh, what? Like, or is every single news organization on Earth also going to just sign up to agree? It's like, just ignore this man?
Yeah, like, that's
if
like...
one of the richest people on Earth...
Twitter. It was, like, every time Donald Trump said something really fucking stupid, where was he? He was all over CNN, all over fucking NBC. Every single time during the presidential race, he would say some dumb shit like, I love taco bowls and Mexicans. Happy Cinco de Mayo. And, like, it's like, really, dude?
Right, and something like that, like, what? Are you going to ban him from Twitter for doing that? I mean, it's offensive, but clearly it doesn't violate the terms and service. It's just offensive, and it's, like, sheer stupidity.
Yeah, and I mean, like, there's also the whole point, like, news organizations can't help themselves, dude. Like
at a certain point, like
Donald Trump, every time Donald Trump says something stupid, CNN is like salivating, like, oh my god, we have to show this guy being an idiot on TV right now.
Well, okay, let's even say that, like, basically the only way to fix the problem is to just
ignore it.
It's basically
just ignore
from the simple, like, what is every single news organ? The problem is, like, ironically, despite the sort of centralizing, sort of the conglomeration of media, despite that, one of the biggest problems is actually just that there are still so many different media outlets out there, okay?
Yeah, they're all competing.
If every single news outlet but one ignores Donald Trump, then guess who's selling by far the most ads? The New York Times. And then what happens? Eventually, the corporate pressure kicks in, and it's like you have to at least do the sort of, like I was talking about in the news discussion from last week, but you have to do the sort of, here are the facts of what happened story, simply out of responsibility as, like, once one person breaks the code of silence, everyone kind of by default has to break the code of silence.
Because
of how the nature of news spreads in society is, something will go viral, that becomes the story, and you can't ignore the story. People will set the story without you, and then you'll just get left behind in the dust.
Yeah, so
to run this back to sort of my censorship thing, this is why this is essentially, like, basically an impossible problem to solve. Because once we start saying, like, yes, let these corporate entities have the rights. Like, I feel kind of uncomfortable saying, like, yes, these corporate entities do have the right to decide what is acceptable free speech and what isn't. Because as soon as we start we're already seeing this on Twitter. People, like, leftists are constantly banned on Twitter for, like, saying the word vagina, which is just, like, a factual description of a bodily organ, while Richard Spencer is allowed on the platform without repercussions. I think Twitter in particular is becoming so fucking dangerous because it clearly has an incredibly right lean, and it's subtle right now, but it's getting worse every day, and it's going to become like a borderline alt-right platform at this point, to be frank. And other platforms are going to start emulating it, like Facebook. I don't think you can describe as anything other than a conservative organization, considering where their business interests lie in the matter. Which,
baby boomers.
Well, yes, that actually is one of the big things. All right, like the average Facebook is now the social media platform for people over 30. Okay, people under 30 tends not to use Facebook.
I mean, we use it as a communication platform. That's about it.
I tend to use Facebook more, but like that's a weird, like, it's probably because I live in Nebraska, to be honest.
But like, I don't even use Facebook. I mean, I surf Reddit, and if demographics are to be believed, that puts me squarely in the middle of theirs, which is like 18 to 27-year-old.
Basically, my point is, like, Facebook's business interests ultimately lie in curtailing to a conservative audience, both on the demographic level of their user base and their business interests, right? Because conservatives are not going to legislate what they put on their because although conservatives will rile up a storm and bitch and whine about Mark Zuckerberg every single time that he says that, like, every single time that they go through and clean up the site slightly of Nazis to appease the centrist media, ultimately, they are on the same side when it comes to their interests, and they have really just started beginning to understand that.
Yeah,
and the more they understand that, the more the algorithm the more eventually, like, basically, there's no reason to believe that they're anything. Basically, it's not that much longer until they realize that, like, oh, what if we just push these people's message outright and censor the other message?
Yeah, I mean,
what are they going to do? Put me in jail? As long as we're pushing their message, they'll win all the elections.
The, Zuck has already said that allowing advertisements that are outright lies is just, quote, something we're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, because that's the first step. It's like they've already made the decision that, like, we're just going to let people say whatever the fuck they want, and whoever has the most money will have the strongest message out. And who has the most money? All the Koch brothers. That's who.
All the money.
And guess what? There's basically no campaign regulations regarding Facebook ads. If Breitbart tomorrow wants to put out an ad that says that, like, 100,000 people are storming the Mexican-American border to, like, rape all of our white women, that will be on Facebook, and it will not violate their terms and conditions. And it's going to keep getting worse from there, because ultimately, Facebook's business interests and corporate interests lie squarely in the more Republicans gain political power, the better off Facebook is. We're already seeing that with Twitter. We're already seeing that with the YouTube. And so maybe ultimately it is basically we just have to make them public in interest and just hope they don't get too fucked up. That may just simply be the only solution, because as long as these public entities that are ultimately run by private corporations, as long as these public entities exist under capitalism, their interest will always be to push the agenda of, that will always be what their economic interests are, which over the short term may not win out, because, when a company is first started, they may have certain level of idealism, because they are ultimately a corporation and can ultimately the left will never be satisfied by choices they make under capitalism. Eventually they will always be pushed to align themselves with the Republican Party of the United States.
Yup. We're screwed. The internet's going to kill us all.
Yeah, so, basically, then the solution simply becomes, the closest thing maybe would be, if the government steps in, breaks apart all of these companies and just basically seizes them by force, and then turns them over to, non-profit organizations. Basically, every single social platform just becomes, the Wikipedia business model. But the problem is, no one's going to donate money for, Facebook to be a thing. Alright, the reason that Wikipedia can run off of a non-profit model is because they ultimately serve a public utility. Facebook is it is a public utility, but not a public utility in the sense that, people are going to donate money for.
Yeah, it's a public utility because it's free messaging, effectively.
Yeah.
And it's, free communication, which...
Once people have something for free, left-leaning government, as corrupt as it can turn, see Mao's government, see Stalin's government, or I should say Lenin's government, that became Stalin's government, it's ultimately more trustworthy than a corporate interest.
I mean, well, yeah, because a corporate interest's number one interest is itself, first and foremost, always.
Because at the very least, if you are unsatisfied, so long as this exists within the framework of democracy, if it is a public utility, then it is subject to the transparency of a public utility in theory.
What if communication platforms were required to, here's wet dream number one. So Title II net neutrality gets restored, and then by extension legislation is passed that requires communication platforms on the internet to obey FCC law.
So, which FCC laws? That's.
I mean, I would assume there would have to be some created, because as far as I know, the internet is still the Wild West.
That could be another thing. Is maybe that's where we're heading. That
FCC regulations.
That the internet essentially becomes as highly regulated as broadcast television is now. Essentially, no more porn, no more underground really of any kind.
That doesn't sound fun.
And maybe that's the solution, and simply we aren't necessarily willing to present that solution simply because it would make the internet ultimately a much less useful utility if it becomes something that must be like FCC compliant, I guess. Plus, it runs into the whole other host of issues where like this podcast or my blog, for example, maybe that becomes like maybe that type of maybe this is ultimately the internet's destiny, where like in the early 2000s, like the internet's already going maybe super slowly toward the direction where just every single thing on the internet is simply corporate. Like there is no more like user generated content in the way that.
Yeah, no, there used to be like a billion websites, and now there's 5, and all of them are sharing screenshots from the other 4.
Yeah. Like, maybe this is ultimately the destiny of the internet, is that it simply just becomes, like, websites are just TV stations. And each has a utility, but, like, a guy with a dream can't, unless he has corporate backing of some kind, can't just start a website. And people who want to just start a podcast or start a YouTube channel can't simply just start a podcast or start a YouTube channel. You have to have corporate backing. And we go back to the old days where if you want to get your music out there, we're back to old fashioned mixtapes and cassette tapes and selling them out the back of vans,
emailing MP3s to record labels.
Yeah, like if you want to start like a blog, you have to literally just email it out to everyone on an email list.
Well, I mean, so like, and this was part of a big.
Blog's maybe not a great. Yeah, it probably is.
This was part of a big massive thing with Article 11 and 13 of the EU CD regarding copyright, and like basically people were worried that their memes were going to get taken down on EU servers because now corporate entities were going to be responsible for copyright infringement.
Right. Well, that's a whole other bag of worms. But
so, like, I guess what I'm getting at is, if we were to institute FCC regulations, would we have to then? I mean, if we wanted to stay as close to an ideal internet as possible, would we have to institute what is effectively a Snopes doctrine, where if you're clearly bullshitting out your ass, then we have to cancel you, and by cancel you mean delete your internet account.
Yeah, well, so ultimately, I guess if this is the destiny of the internet, then essentially social media is just no longer exists, right?
And yeah, that's the other thing. Social media as a business model and as a general service and existence,
Well, this is why ultimately the wet dream will probably this is ultimately kind of a fruitless conversation, because so long as unless just American society and America's sort of political compass changes in a drastic level, basically unless it gets to the point where the internet is literally just responsible for the Third World War,
Civil War Part 2, Electric Boogaloo /
which will never be a podcast episode. Because oh boy, do I have some thoughts on
the Civil War Part 2, Electric Boogaloo,
the Second American Civil War that I've shared with you, but that will never be a podcast episode. I promise you.
Previously on,
just because so I don't feel like I can say that without a context, so I'll just say type in second. So a good place to start without getting yourself into trouble and on a watch lists is type in Robert Evans, who formerly, you might know him as the Cracked writer if you're kind of in my generation. The Cracked.com writer did a lot of he after Cracked.com kind of fired all their good writers and became BuzzFeed Part 2.
Correct.
He did a bunch of journalism stuff for a while, and then one of the podcasts that he's put out is It Could Happen Here. It's a part of the iHeartRadio network, and he kind of details a lot of the stuff that I've detailed in a little, probably too much detail to some of my friends, but he kind of explains okay, if people wanted to start Second American Civil War, there are certain targets you could hit that would hurt the economy, that a relatively small amount of people could hit with and cause a lot of damage. You wouldn't need that many people to damage the U.S. economy if you really knew where to hit. and that there are plenty of people online that have discussed this stuff in detail. I will leave that there. I won't go into detail about how they would go about it because it's a little bit different. One guy with a podcast versus someone who's like a serious journalist going into a little bit more nuanced detail of how that would happen. But that's a good starting point. And if you want to know more, again, if you're at this point, this level of notoriety that I have, pretty much anyone who's listening to this probably can just hit me up. So, I can explain this stuff to detail to you if you'd like, but it's not something that's going to be discussed on this podcast.
Nope.
So
not yet.
Anyway, my point is, unless the internet is the primary catalyst for
something,
just massive outbreaks of violence, we'll call it.
Sure.
I don't see that anything resembling that ever happening. I simply see the status quo of the internet existing until something violent causes a fundamental change to basically every level of society, similar to how World War II fundamentally changed most aspects of society post-World War II. Like, the legacy of World War II is we're in a sort of like post-traditional warfare society. Like, countries do not have territorial wars with other countries pretty much anymore. Other than, like, incredibly... Like, the closest thing we have to that is like Russia taking one small sliver of island from the Ukraine.
Kashmir. The Pakistani.
Yeah.
India
like,
situation.
basically
but that's been disputed historically for, like, ever.
Yeah, like, basically you have authoritarian governments taking really tiny, petty land grabs and pockets of land throughout the Middle East and Africa whose, cultural ownership has been in dispute for many generations and will likely never get fixed until, World War III again makes a massive fundamental shift to society. Like, historically, now we're getting... Can't believe we got here from ContraPoints. So, historically, every century in human history has basically had 1 to 2 massive wars.
Okay.
And we have not had one in the 21st century.
No, we'll get there.
So in theory, like, if unless we are in like a post-war society where like we have somehow since World War, like, basically, if you look at just the course of human history, we are long overdue. It's been essentially almost 100 years since the last major world-level conflict, which would be World War II. Prior to that, it was World War I. Prior to that, it was like the Opium Wars in China, Indochina, and basically all the different colonial wars. Prior to that, it was all the conflicts between what was the French Empire and what was the British Empire. Prior to that, it was... I'm in the 1600s?
Sure.
What was the major conflict? Then you get into basically the tail end of the Crusades.
Yeah, and also
Constantinople,
the British Empire,
the Genesis. Yeah, so you get into the Genesis of the British Empire. You get into sort of the absolute, early in that century. You get into sort of the last tail end of the Crusades, the fall of Constantinople. Prior to that, you get into the Roman conflicts. Basically, human history dictates that there will be at least 2 major conflicts or one really long major conflict in the 18th century example I gave, which was basically the Napoleonic French Wars, the 100-Year War. Basically, there's 2 centuries worth of France-England wars.
Yeah,
But essentially, you'll have either one war that's long enough to constitute 2 wars, or 2 massive world, at least continent level, because once you get past the 1800s, there's not enough travel for it to be a truly global scale. But continent level, massive human conflicts with all the human rights travesties that will always happen to this. Basically, history dictates that we are long overdue for another massive human conflict. So unless we live in a post-war society, then it dictates that like World War III or the American Civil War, basically trigger like maybe the version of what is the next human conflict is basically hundreds of proxy wars fought within the borders of nations being fought between the politically oppressed and the political oppressors. Given that we are social, like this is now getting into like Mason's probably half-baked. So this is a new segment of the podcast called Mason's Half-Baked Sociological Theories.
Oh god.
So the theory that I would like to posit is that the next version of the global society level cataclysm is not going to be a war fought between. It's not going to be Call of Duty Modern Warfare or Battlefield 4 or whatever.
It's
where
not
like
going to be a military.
the Federation is fighting NATO.
Okay.
The newest version, we will come up with at some point. I think we are even starting to see what is the very early genesis of this. Is that the new version of World War III is not a country versus country war, but essentially the political underclass or the global community of the politically oppressed versus the global community of the political oppressors. And you're seeing this happen in Brazil, you're seeing this happen in China with the Hong Kong situation, and right now it's mostly just, for the most part, it's protests that are being violently attacked. But I don't think we can say we're that much far away from, like, if all of these authoritarian governments keep responding to this in violence, then logically it must dictate that at some point the response to that violence will be violence, and then that's how a civil war starts. And what happens is, like, if we're tweeting, if we in America are like, democracy for Hong Kong, then how much more, from the point of view of someone who's a political underclass in the United States, how much more oppressed is Hong Kong than, a black trans person here in the U.S.? Then they start getting ideas. And I think we even saw, like, we saw what I think is the genesis of this with, like, what we now would call the Arab Spring movement, where several countries in the Middle East, Egypt, Libya, Syria, all broke out in the civil wars, where basically these authoritarian governments were overthrown, like, practically overnight.
Yeah, and, there's just riots breaking out everywhere, and I can't help but think that there might be some credence to the concept of a global civil war.
Yeah.
I mean, China has Hong Kong fighting back.
Now you're seeing all the shit that's happening in Chile.
Lebanon, Chile, Iraq is rioting. But the thing, Iraq shut the entire country of Iraq. Their internet is gone. They shut it down.
Yeah.
The only reason I know about it is because a grainy photo got posted on, made it to the top of Reddit like a week ago, and that was it. Iraq is rioting, guys. Look it up.
Iraq is rioting. Hong Kong is rioting. Chile is rioting.
Lebanon is rioting.
Egypt is. People don't even talk about Egypt anymore, but like basically the Muslim Brotherhood that essentially took over the Mubarak government. However, it's turning against them because they haven't been all that much better as a replacement. And one of the interesting things about the Egyptian uprisings is that in particular was kind of an uprising led by like a burgeoning middle class, which I think is what eventually is going to start happening in like the China mainland. Because like how much longer are like, the Chinese, the Chinese government, for all the intricate censorship that they have constructed, it simply can't, it simply is, the world is too interconnected for that to succeed on any massive level.
It's not sustainable. I mean, that's interesting because I heard about a story of a guy who teaches English in China getting back to the States like maybe 2 weeks ago, and it was the first that he had ever heard of the Hong Kong protests. Which is concerning.
Yeah, but I think like that sort of the infrastructure of censorship in China is starting to crack, simply because like you know Chinese citizens they have VPNs in China.
Do we need to like?
If you want,
are we going to reach a point where we have to do the North Korea thing with China?
What do you mean?
So there are.
You mean like America treats China like they do North Korea?
No, there are certain nonprofits in the States and in other Western nations that take donations of flash drives full of popular culture, etc., and smuggle them in to North Korea for North Korean citizens. And I'm wondering if at some point we're going to end up reaching that level of
I think something along those lines happen, although I think the difference is like America kind of explicitly endorses that program, which frankly the American government, if anything, will try to hush up a program like that tries to do that for China.
Yeah, because it's too profitable to work with China.
Now I think it's also probably true that the CIA, off to the side, would also love if that happened. It's just that'll be something that like is more below ground versus like the North Korea stuff is well above ground, just because like no one respects North Korea as an economy or a country, versus China has respect that like you kind of have to do it more behind their back.
Yeah, because China.
But I wouldn't be shocked to find out that's like I think we'll probably find out that something a lesser version of that has been happening probably for a while. I'd be willing to bet.
Because China's a massive geopolitical threat, or just power in general. You know?
Yeah. But so that there's I feel like I did a lot of talking and made you just listen. You should say some words now.
Oh God, okay.
How do you feel about my theory about the Third World War?
I don't think it's off base. However, I'm really, really, really hesitant to get on board with the concept that the Hong Kong situation can happen here. Because the way the geopolitics of Hong Kong and China are so fundamentally unique that I don't think that anything could possibly be replicated on that level in the United States. Because in the United States, I think that people are homogenous enough to the point where if you have an entire city rioting, you're also going to have other entire cities rioting. Like, you know, if Hong Kong was happening in a context where like it was actually just part of China proper, then Shanghai would also be rioting, and Beijing would be rioting. And so, like, with that in mind, I think that if we're going to have a full-scale violent rebellion in the United States, it would be massive.
Yeah, like I actually think so. Hong Kong's probably the worst out of the examples I listed because it is so
localized,
geologically clear-cut.
And it's also weird. Like, it's just so... It's like an island in the middle of a Red Sea. Like, it's just the weirdest situation.
Yeah, like, just the geological realities of it construct a very specific situation that doesn't necessarily follow the same contours of some of the other... So let's ignore the Hong Kong in particular. But, like... So, with, like, Brazil...
Yeah, Brazil would be closer, yeah.
Or Chile, right? Like, those are countries that are essentially, at worst, what they would call second world countries, like, basically...
Developing nations.
Well, so, third world country is sort of what people refer... Isn't that what they call a developing nation?
Okay, it's, I guess we should classify this. Yeah, developing is third world... industrialized second world, or they're like getting there, and then first world is like fully industrialized, fully developed, you know.
So I guess
part of the national Western geopolitical coalition.
Yeah, so basically, like, the distinction that we're drawing simply for, you know, purposes of our discussion, because there's a lot of much smarter people than us having these arguments about what constitutes third, second, first world country, whether we should even have those categories as countries for a whole host of more sort of political and social justice reasons. But for the ease of having this discussion, we will define basically a third world country as a country in which essentially has massive poverty that, large, a borderline majority or close to majority has difficulty accessing food and water. That's what we'll discuss in third world country.
Basic needs.
A second world country is beyond, for the most part, beyond the issue of scarcity of basic needs, but doesn't necessarily have access to the most modern version of different utilities we have. Like, they have internet, but oftentimes dial-up internet or basic cable modem internet versus Ethernet like we have, or fiber optic cable like plenty of other countries have.
Yeah. Or
and then a first world country is a country where pretty much everyone has air conditioning, pretty much everyone has internet.
Yeah.
That is the distinction. So Brazil,
if we're
Chile,
comparing levels of comfort, third world is trying to survive. Second world is trying to enjoy life, and first world is trying to stop being depressed.
Yeah, basically the two distinctions I make between a second and a first world country is the second world country, it's kind of they have technology, but only up to a certain point.
We'll have the technology.
Vaguely call it somewhere between the 70s and the 90s as far as typical technological. When I say have the technology, I mean simply the average person has access to that technology, because in all of these countries, even the third world countries, there are plenty of rich people who have access to all of these luxuries. We're talking about
the general populace,
the standard of living for the general populace. So the second world countries has a lot of these luxuries, but not the newest version of these luxuries. They're on the iPhone 2.
Yeah, they're a few decades behind.
Plenty of them live in most of them have housing, but a lot of them live in housing without air conditioning.
So England, wait, that's not right.
Haha, I get it, because England is cold. So to go back to it, Brazil and Chile or places like that are probably the most comparable. Because, with Brazil, we'll use Brazil because I think both of us are much more educated about the situation in Brazil than we are with Chile, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, that's fair to say.
So, with Brazil, a lot of the conflict that is happening in that country falls along political lines that are identifiable within a context that would be recognizable to the political divides within a contemporary country such as America or England.
I mean, yeah, fair enough.
So that to me is sort of that's what would happen in a lot of what we define as sort of the premier sort of security council countries. Whether that be China, whether that be America.
What about the 99 or the Yellow Jacket movement in France?
I think the Yellow Jacket movement is getting there. It's sort of very... I don't... Correct me, I probably should do more research on the Yellow Jackets. This might be we might have to do a sequel pod to this discussion, because I'd like to know more about some of these movements before I go into great detail, but because my understanding is that the Yellow Jacket movement has not necessarily gotten, at least consistently... There hasn't been a consistent response of violence toward the Yellow Jackets in the same way with, Brazil protesters.
Oh, no, there hasn't. French know how to riot.
There have been a few, certainly overzealous government reactions to Yellow Vest protests, and the Yellow Vest protests have certainly gotten to a point of, property damage. But that is an entirely different sphere of what... But I certainly think that the Yellow Vest protests in France are certainly a genesis to what we could see in the future, similar to how, I would even say, the Wall Street protests here in America are an even sort of earlier zygote version of what we're now seeing in France.
Oh, Occupy? Yeah, I mean, and I think that's, I think that would be the first thing we would see.
The sort of thing we're seeing, with the things we've seen now, and, we've had several clashes between let's just call them the alt-right and for lack of a more cohesive term, Antifa.
Yeah, the people who don't like Nazis.
We've seen it in
and
Oregon,
Nazis.
we've seen it in Charlottesville was the highest profile one because it was a total shit show, and then a woman got ran over with and murdered with a car. But there have been other versions of this. It's becoming tiny little microcosm, and I think the biggest version of this that we don't necessarily see is all the shit that's happening with the pipeline up in North Dakota. With the Standing Rock, or is it South Dakota?
It's
the Standing Rock protests.
Yeah, the Standing Rock protests. I actually don't remember.
Like, that shit's getting to the point where, like, that is really fucking starting to resemble some of the stuff we're seeing in these other countries you mentioned.
You know, I gotta be honest, that's still going?
It's not going to the same degree, but, like...
Okay, because I remember there was, like... I was in college when I was finding out that 10,000 Native Americans were making a pilgrimage to Standing Rock.
Well, there was some real fucking shit that happened there, like 6 or 7 months ago.
I think I remember hearing about that, but I'm not sure. But, like, it was like the mad...
Like, it's a situation where it just blows up every several months. Like, people protest it, and then now the police are basically just becoming the tool of the corporate rights to be used against these protests. Like, at what point does it just become like it's going to just keep getting worse and worse. We'll have riots that last 3 or 4 days, and then eventually riots will become like, militia movements, which will be stamped, initially they'll be stamped out right away, but
yeah, like it just, I don't fucking know, man. Like, Standing Rock's full on.
And I think particularly if Trump wins the election again. I think that might just trigger everything that I'm talking about, because Trump is so influential just worldwide.
Yeah, and he's already fucked up everything. I mean, we abandoned the Kurds. We are actively denying global warming and refusing to sign on to solutions to help that. We are...
everything bad a country can do, we're doing it.
Well, I mean, we're not invading people yet. But we're, like, making political moves that help our enemies and putting tariffs on our allies. We're backing out of negotiations with potentially hostile
foreign exactly nations. To my point, like, the contours of this conflict that I'm talking about are global, right? Like, Trump and Putin. There's clearly when I believe it was Bush referred to several countries as an axis of evil.
I'm assuming he probably was talking about Russia, China, and North Korea. The only three.
I think it was like all Middle Eastern. Russia might have been there.
Maybe Iran.
Yeah, I think it was like Iran, Afghanistan. It was like all Middle Eastern countries, and then they might have threw Russia in there. China was certainly not on the axis of evil radar in the 2000s.
That would be.
They were just kind of like the guys who make cheap shit for us back then. Yeah. China is sort of what they are now. Is just they're a completely different force than they were in like 2003 when he said that quote.
Yeah.
Or at least they were a different force as far as like we, the average consumer of politics understood them.
Yeah. And I mean, like, what really frustrates me is we had a shot at, being chill with Iran. And maybe
we had a shot for a lot of things, but I think
keeping them stable.
Anyway, my point is, like, I don't think he was that far off when he said the axis of evil thing. I think where he made the diagnosed is like America at this point is firmly within the axis of evil. Like, just the American government, and if we replace it with a Democrat president, I don't think that changes anything. Like, America is still ultimately within the axis of evil unless Sanders wins the election and is this transformative candidate that everyone thinks he's going to be. And, even if Sanders wins, let's see America, immediately pull out of all these military interventions they've done before, and end all drone strikes immediately before we start talking about Sanders as this transformative candidate that is going to firmly remove America and push it toward a direction of sort of a Nordic model of living.
Well, I mean, I think the tricky bit about that is anybody who takes over the leadership of America, regardless of whether or not it's a democratic election or if it's a coup, for all that matter, the problem is there is still American military over in the Middle East, regardless, and if it's going to be an ethical leader that's leading the American Fed, then they have a responsibility to not do what we're doing right now and abandon the people we're trying to help, allegedly. Or, because, so basically what is happening, or has happened for the past 18 years, is we took a giant fucking hammer to a wood table that's currently standing, and we knocked out one of the legs. And then we put ourselves where the leg was to stand there. And
right. See, I would argue
the table falls over, and then we have to deal with, possibly 9/11 Part 2 Electric Boogaloo, along with permanent, or not even necessarily permanent, but long-lasting destabilization and setbacks for positive progressive movements in the Middle East, because we already hit that reset button once in the 70s, and we still have massive hyper-conservative leadership in the Middle East. There's this popular post on Reddit that gets reposted every 3 months, and it's a picture of a woman in Iran in the 70s, and she doesn't have a hijab or a niqab on or a burqa, and she's wearing a mini skirt or a shorter skirt that shows her knees and a blouse, and she looks like she's a businesswoman or something, I don't fucking know. But it's a very classical 70s liberal image, but instead of a white person, she's brown. And now it's different. You know what changed? America backed fundamentalist rebels because we didn't like the commies.
Right, because essentially that the liberal government was a threat to American business interests. That's why they did it. There's no...
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean, ultimately, either America, until America's influence is, basically stamped out of the world via, Civil War, or a truly transformative, radical candidate over probably multiple terms it will take, radically the problem with Obama, to some degree, I think Obama went in with the plan is clearly he sort of set the tone in that direction, but then he's I have to do this, 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 and this. It's going to make America's economy this much worse. It's going to cost us this many jobs. And he made the calculus, I think, fairly early on, where he's just I'm not going to be the one who pulls the plug on all this, because guess what? When that happens, America's citizens' lives are going to be worse. That's just a reality.
And that means that
you and I, and frankly, probably everyone who's going to listen to this podcast, our lives are made better, more comfortable, more luxuries, fast food, and all that shit, because we profit from all this. We too, with the cheap luxury goods, and I am defining, cheap flat screen televisions, gaming consoles, even something as simple as getting a delicious 10 chicken McNugget meal delivered to you in less than a minute. Or, if you're a lazy piece of shit, you can get it on Postmates now. All of that infrastructure is made possible in large part because of the war profiteering and constant protection. It's easy for someone on the left to say, let's just get rid of every single corporate entity because they make everything worse. But the reality is, pretty much everyone benefits from what these corporate entities do.
Yep.
That's why we, for decades, have allowed these corporate entities to exist. And while leaders who I think probably to some degree had transformative notions, whether that be Lyndon B. Johnson with sort of, his whole thing was the war on poverty. And then he was oh, yeah, if I pull all these people out of Iraq, everyone's reason, or not, fucking hell.
You'll get there.
Pull all these people out of Vietnam, America's influence will decrease by this much, which means which means these sectors of the economy are less profitable, which means it makes these people's lives worse that are already all the middle class, which is the majority of Americans, or their lives get worse in this way, and this way, and then I'm out of office and I can't improve anything. Yeah. That is the calculus that every single president with good intentions, and whether any of them having good intentions, that's a philosophical question that I'm not really interested in diving this time. But I think it's pretty clear that Obama was like, and who knows how radically it is, but clearly he came in there with a plan to make America, a much less sort of, more of a shining city on a hill type diplomacy versus the traditional interventionist trading gun for cocaine diplomacy.
Our country, baby.
But ultimately, when Obama left, it is essentially the same type of diplomacy, and his legacy was basically just moderate improvements to the lives of people with student loans and health conditions. And granted, some of that is because of the legislative blocks put in place by Republicans. That is true.
And that's the other thing that people have to consider, that a president has to consider on top of, the calculus of impacting citizens and benefiting citizens. They have to consider that whatever action they take, regardless of whether it's ethical or not, if we were to stop doing whatever the fuck, and it impacts the lives of Joanne and Cletus and Herb and Karen, they're gonna be like, the president's making milk cost $6 a gallon. They're not gonna be like, oh, well, milk is $6 a gallon because we're no longer destabilizing the Middle East and watching out for corporate interests, so corporations are charging us more for it. They're going to be like, we got to get this president out of here, and if it's his first 2 years in the term, then you know what they're going to do? They're going to vote for Republicans in the Senate. And you know what that means? Mitch McConnell happens. And when Mitch McConnell happens, real dumb shit happens.
Which, I mean, ultimately I still side on, because when I say people's lives worse, I'm pretty much strictly speaking of, short term. So, long term, I think you'd probably argue people's lives get better, because as they become sort of less dependent for their people's lives become better short term because they're used to having things, and then they don't have these things. And the reality about a lot of these things is that they're probably not good for us.
It's kind of like regulating Amazon. Of course, people are going to be upsetty for a whole month that they don't get 2-day shipping, so that workers at Amazon warehouses can sit down without dying of a heart attack. And they don't have to scan things every 2 minutes. Of course people are going to be mad about it, but the bottom line is we're not being shitty, dude. And you're back to 2010, where you just had to wait an extra 2 or 3 days to get things in the mail. Whoop-de-doo. There's the going and circling back to Facebook, etc., being FCC regulated and so on. Once people have access to something for free, or once people have access to something that they find exceptionally convenient, they don't want to fucking have that change. It makes them upset. But I would argue that once they lose it, eventually they'll just get used to it again.
Well, and I think the thing is when these changes happen, and they probably won't happen because nothing good ever happens, but theoretically, if these changes happen in society where just consumerism in general is much less because there's just less things available because of less war profiteering, then I think over the course of 3-4 years, even people's lives are worse. But I think when we're talking the course of entire generations, the quality of life, I do believe, becomes better because people, given
over generations.
One of the things that I think that the old guy point that I kind of agree with, as someone who kind of this is more of just anecdotal and personal, but as I've kind of, I think one of the times I was the least depressed. This is fun. One of the least depressing times in my life was when I had moved up in Omaha and I was living by myself for I think about 7-8 months before Chase, the roommate of mine, moved in with me. And during that period of time, my daily routine, and I was working really hard on dieting and trying to lose weight. Unlike now, I'm not doing that. Uh-huh. But one of the happiest time, I don't even want to say happy, I want to say least, because certainly I feel like I have more euphoric highs when I can consume everything like a locust, but I think one of the most just satisfied with where I am in a certain place in time is when I was living in Omaha. I had basically no money, so I couldn't really go out and spend and go out to bars and stuff, because most of my money was either going to pay off my parents for stuff that they loaned me money for, or rents, or I think I was paying off a car then. I had plenty of things to spend my money on. So basically, I was eating healthy, and basically my routine was wake up, shower stuff, go to work. I'd get home about 10. I would go to the gym, spend a couple hours late. So my shift was at an afternoon shift, so I didn't have to wake up early. But for the people who didn't think I was sleeping 4 hours a day, that was another nice thing. I actually slept a lot because I didn't do a lot of social stuff. But woke up, and then I wrote fictional stuff mostly. Now I kind of mostly write pseudo-philosophical stuff.
You write thought pieces.
And then woke up and basically rinse and repeat. And I didn't have a lot of things, but I had something resembling a purpose, something resembling a routine, and just the lack of objects in my life didn't matter all that much, because ultimately,
that's not a defining.
If things to do with your life are not easily given to you, whether that be Netflix, whether that be fast food, whether that be giant flat screen TVs, then I think when you have to put in a little effort to entertain yourself, you are ultimately a little bit happier.
Yeah.
All right. I think that about covered. So anyway, my point is, if we get rid of reward profiteering and get rid of all these consumerist items, I think overall we'll be a happier folks. And that doesn't mean you can't have a PS4 or whatever, but I just think that less consumerism in our lives will make us happier. We didn't have...
I think that, definitely a cultural shift. Is your phone?
Nah, I'm just checking the time. Okay. Yeah, we've been recording for 2 hours.
Jesus. I think that there isn't necessarily a cultural shift that needs to happen where it's not commonplace for a corporate entity to put out Christmas trees in October, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily hate Christmas. It's, people are religious or whatever, and it's an excuse to get together with your family, and when maybe you don't as often as you should. But I touched on this in the last one, but we have a lot of things that we buy on a regular basis, disposable and replaceable, and sometimes not replaceable necessarily, that are explicitly derived from exploitation of third world nations that can't stop us. It's
pistachios.
Or the shit in your cell phone.
Yeah.
And it's just sad. And there's this repeated discussion that I see where, and I do agree to an extent, and it's I try to be better, but at the same time, it's hard, where
this has to be a top-down change because it's exceptionally unfair to ask a populace that has the spending power of it's like a billionth of a corporate entity to, well, just stop eating meat, just stop enjoying this thing that you can enjoy, and like expect every single person to take some social responsibility, when the better thing to do would be to encourage and possibly enforce change in a top-down dynamic where you force companies that are importing gold that's used as a conductor in cell phones to compensate the nations and or people that get that for them fairly. Like, that's ethical consumption. Doesn't like
it's possible. Like,
it's
despite
ethical consumption is possible, but ethical consumption has to start with people selling shit that's ethical.
Yeah,
because otherwise, people in America can't just not buy a cell phone.
Yeah.
And I guarantee that every single cell phone that exists, period, is in existence at least in due part due to exploitation. And it has to start at the top, because otherwise you are asking people who commute to work to live on a bi-weekly basis, otherwise they will not make it, to give up something that allows them to continue to exist on a bi-weekly basis.
Yeah.
And that's not fair.
It's a good thought to wrap up on. Fortunately, Adam Sandler will have to wait.
You sure you don't want to do a 10-minute discussion?
I can...
Nah, it's fine. We don't have to.
I don't know. Do you have a lot of Adam Sandler thoughts?
I mean, I don't like him. I don't like his movies. That's about it.
Do you have any thoughts about Uncut Gems?
I saw the trailer. I'm really intrigued.
Yeah, I saw the Joker, right?
Yeah. I'm really intrigued.
I was like, he's got a goatee. I didn't realize he could grow facial hair. Is it like prosthetic?
Yeah, I was just super intrigued by the concept.
I've never seen Adam Sandler with even a hint of facial hair. I didn't think it was physically possible.
I've seen him in
paparazzi photos, maybe.
Paparazzi photos.
Okay, maybe. I mean, he could grow facial hair. I've never seen him as a facial hair guy.
It's so weird.
It's certainly not a neat, trimmed facial hair guy.
Well, I mean, and the weird thing that struck me about this movie is once I saw his face, my instant thought was, oh good, it's another man-child movie. And then it really didn't seem like it was going to be.
And then it started hitting the dramatic beats, and he's like,
hold up.
I was with the prostitutes. It meant nothing. I felt nothing. Give me another chance. And then the dumpster kiss is like, brr, 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 and it's showing Kevin Garnett basically just walking back and forth like a fucking shark, like he's about to eat Adam Sandler.
It's such a weird,
that's the worst bet I've ever heard. I disagree, Larry. I disagree.
Oh yeah, he also just sounds ridiculous. Every time I hear Adam,
what's that accent?
I don't fucking know, dude. New York.
Is it a good accent? Is it a good accent or the worst accent I've ever heard?
Yes. No, it's probably the worst accent you've ever heard. Let me put it this way, and I'm with all due respect to Adam
I have
Sandler,
literally no idea. So, if someone can answer, let me know.
I mean, with all due respect to Adam Sandler, with which I have very little because he made The Ridiculous Six, the man's not a good actor for the most part.
So here's the thing that interested me, though. This is why I wanted to talk about it. Adam Sandler, for whatever reason, has been kind of a white whale for particularly the 90s generation of real auteur directors. He's been kind of a white whale for all of them. Paul Thomas Anderson has him in Punch Drunk Love. A film that is, I would say, probably my least favorite of the ones that I've seen. But it's clearly much better than his typical affair, the Jack and Jill, the Pixels, the
It's a man-child playing a 80s third grader stuck in an adult body. Yeah, no.
That's not what that movie is. And there have been a couple since then that it's once a decade or so he comes out with a movie that is critically acclaimed or oh, here's the Adam Sandler that everyone loved. And like I think the one that I've seen that I was like, oh, this is good, which I didn't. To me, the difference between this role and the other roles, we'll get to that in a second, but like in Punch Drunk Love and Funny People, the two movies of his that are like kind of critically acclaimed that I've seen are like, they're not that far removed from like Jack and Jill Adam Sandler. They're just less cartoonish. Like, they're still basically a schmuck. It's just like a schmuck who's a real guy rather than a schmuck
who's cartoonishly schmuck to
who's
the
like
point
a
where you can barely believe it.
cartoonish schmuck. And this
like,
character doesn't seem that like that at all, which is why I was like,
he's like the
what?
He's not even like and maybe it's just like the problem is Adam Sandler's from the Tom Cruise generation of actors where you don't.
Do you have like a point to make about 90s actors?
No, hang on. I can't remember the fucking name. What's the golf one?
Oh, Jesus, this is awful. Happy Gilmore.
So, when you see Happy Gilmore, you don't see the character. You see Adam Sandler being an asshole and trying to be funny. Like, every single movie that I'm ever aware of with Adam Sandler in it, it's Adam Sandler playing a character. It's George Clooney playing a character. It's Tom Cruise being Tom Cruise playing a character. You know what I mean?
I would argue
Adam
Tom
Sandler,
Cruise at his best is not like that, though. I think you're definitely
maybe
alluding.
That's what I'm getting to is that it really sucks because Adam Sandler at his best is way off brand. Apparently, from what I've heard, I haven't seen the movie. The Cobbler is really good, and he like flexes his dramatic chops big time.
Yeah, that's probably the other one I was missing. It's like once a decade he does a movie like that, and everyone loves it. I haven't seen that particular one. Like I said,
or Click, I guess, is really like surprisingly hard.
I've seen Click. It
is it?
It was his attempt at that one for that decade.
Okay.
The problem is like it doesn't commit fully to the dramatic elements, so it's like 50% a serious dramatic movie with it's basically like a time travel movie.
Well, yeah.
Like the dramatic is definitely interesting, but like it has the Adam Sandler comedic elements, and they're just as bad as like the Jack and Jill comedic elements. Like one of the running bits is like he'll use the rewind button to get through sex with his overqualified hot wife, which is like, why would that be what you use the fast forward button? This isn't what sitcoms have taught me, but.
Well, yeah, like, and there's this really fucking, I don't know. When Adam Sandler tries to be funny, it hurts my brain. And I don't, and so consequently, because like in almost every single movie that I know him for, he's trying to be funny, his face makes me angry. And so when I see him in the trailer, I'm like, oh, motherfucker. Yeah. And then it was like this, and I'm like...
Well, the goatee helps, and also like, either...
Am I gonna have to? I was sitting in the theater, thinking to myself, "Am I gonna have to see this movie? Are you really going to is my brain really gonna make me go watch in a theater and pay money to see an Adam Sandler movie?"
Now, you have to understand. As you know, though, this has like so many of like the Mason erogenous zones of movies. So you've got gambling, you've got sports. There appears to be a heist element. You have titties. And butts. You have bad guys making poor decisions at the cost of their family's safety. Like, it's almost like most of my erogenous zones for what I'm looking for in media in this movie.
Yeah, it's like you're about...
They have Kevin Garnett, a real basketball player. I think the movie... What's crazy is, like, Kevin Garnett's such a force of personality. I bet you thought that guy was just, like, an actor. He's the tall black guy that...
Dude, you're not helping. I don't know.
There's only one 7-foot tall black guy in that trailer.
Wait, he was 17 tall. Okay. I don't remember the trailer much, to be honest. I understand the premise.
He's the one that keeps looking at Adam Sandler like he's a shark and he's about to fucking eat him.
Yeah, I know, but like it's...
He's the one at the very end of the trailer.
I understand. It's like
it's like, oh yeah, baby, and then all of a sudden you get punched in the face because it's Adam Sandler. That's what's happening to me,
Yeah.
man. And then you gotta decide, do I like getting slapped during sex, or am I gonna have to call this one a no-go and leave? Is it worth it?
But anyway, I kind of want to tie this back to my. I'm glad we've lightened this up. I'm in a better mood now. I'm glad of now that we've talked about how like consumerism is crushing our souls. Now we're talking about a movie, but
Yeah, let's go for a complete tone
that
change.
cost like 10 million African water wells, and is about some guy who constantly trades African water wells based on how many points someone scores in the basketball game.
Well,
But
I mean, isn't the whole premise of the story is that he's looping bets? Like,
Yeah.
he's basically betting money, borrowing
I did a
money
little
to bet
research.
money, to bet money, to bet money, to bet money, to bet money.
more or less, it has the tone of a biographical movie, but I don't think it's biographical because I couldn't find anything where it's like based. So it doesn't say based on a true story in the trailer.
Well, even if it does say that, I don't necessarily believe it.
I like certainly.
Blair Witch Project said that.
Yeah, but well, that was a little Blair Witch Project.
Actually, Blair Witch Project did not say that. They just marketed it as an actual found footage thing. Don't
Yeah.
mind me.
So, like with the Adam Sandler thing, we'll get to the Uncut Gem things first, and then I want to wrap up with like some discussion of Adam Sandler's career. So, rewind. So, from my research on the movie, and granted, I didn't like spend an hour trying to dig in. I don't want to like accidentally find the leaked script of the movie or whatever, but. I spent about 20 minutes Googling around various gossip sites and whatnot. Couldn't find, I think at most, maybe it's like a Goodfellas situation where there is a real Henry Hill, but the story is essentially fiction inspired by blank.
I mean, it could be something
within
like,
that sort of category.
I mean, the Goodfellas was inspired by what, the Lucchese crime family?
No,
Or what-
Henry Hill was a real guy.
Oh, I think Godfather was. They were
Like
inspired.
Godfather strays further from that lane because it was like, oh, I read the stuff about the Lucchese and like a couple of the anecdotes in that movie, but it doesn't really follow the parameters of like any
A life story.
real life story in the way that like the
Goodfellas.
rise and fall of Henry Hill. It follows the general contours of the real life of Henry Hill,
Mhm.
where basically like the real Henry Hill had a similar personality, and he rose up in the ranks of this crime family, ratted out his compatriots after they all got caught, and then ended up in witness protection.
Mhm.
That general contour is what actually happened to the real Henry Hill, and the made up stuff is all the details, whether it's like
Yeah, it's
you
all
know, killing the
artistic
guy,
license.
all the right, and it doesn't present itself like based on a true story, and even the way that like Wolf of Wall Street is based on a true story. A lot of that shit most of that shit actually happened.
Yeah.
Whether it's like the strippers and prostitutes in the building, that actually happened. All the shit on the boat where the guy that was going to be sending them their money, like
Jordan fucking Belfort.
yeah, like most of the anecdotes in that movie actually happened versus like Goodfellas, the anecdotes mostly didn't happen. Just the general contour and the
general
personality
arc.
of the main character, that very basic outline of the is what happened. And that's kind of except I couldn't find a guy that Adam Sandler is supposed to be based off of. But I almost feel like
I feel like,
he just seems too well defined to be not based on someone.
Well, who's
Maybe these are just the best writers ever, these Safdie brothers.
Well, hold up. Let me take a look at something real quick because I don't want to speak out of turn. So, thank God for the internet. Hashtag censor me, bitch.
What are you looking up?
So,
Oh, we're on live radio.
he's not producing it or directing it. It seems like he's Adam Sandler.
Yeah, I could tell you he wasn't directing it. It's these Safdie brothers.
I have no idea who they are.
Haven't made a movie that I've seen. they're kind of up and coming talent, and this is their first like real big budget movie. Like I think the last movie they had done I'd heard of but hadn't seen.
Daddy Longlegs, Lenny Cook, Heaven Knows What, Good Time. So yeah,
I think that last one you read off, Heaven Knows What Good Time, that was
Heaven Knows What and Good Time are two separate ones.
Fuck me, I guess I haven't heard
Good
of
Time stars Robert Pattinson as a bank robber that on the run with his developmentally disabled brother, Betty Savdy.
That sounds like a really interesting movie that I guess I haven't heard of.
This is a freaking
Robert Pattinson as a like a bank robber with a heart of gold. So like these people are like on the level where like they've made small budget films, but of like they've gotten
this
to
is
like
the first
level
thing where like they have a trailer featuring behind Joker. Yeah, that's nuts. And I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is, you know, it could just be that he's well defined because Adam Sandler didn't write the part.
No. Like I'm obviously Adam Sandler didn't write the movie. I'm not even arguing that. My point is just like he seems so well defined to the point where like he feels like a real character.
Well, I mean, it's also like not an improbable concept. You know, somebody who borrows money to pay off debt to borrow money.
Let me put it this way: if I find out that like there's just no real life inspiration for this outside of the very general concept of just like guys wheeling and dealing and digging himself further into gambling debt, like.
I'd be surprised.
I'm just going to be really impressed up front.
I mean, I don't think that I would be surprised.
Like, there's a level of...
I'd be happy, actually.
Yeah, I'm digging too much into, like, these very surface level stuff in the trailer. Alright, and then the last thing I want to discuss, and then we really need to wrap up because I'm dead tired, need to go home, go to sleep, go to work the next day, yada, 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 yada. Is, so the white whale subplot. So like I said, Adam Sandler, like once a decade or like once every 6 or 7 years, seems to be dug up from his crypt, the crypt that is that Jack and Jill and Pixels, to do these
bomb
what are called serious dramatic roles. And what's interesting to me is like I have never, even in really these dramatic, and like I said, I haven't. What was the one that you named? I hadn't seen that one.
Oh, The Cobbler.
Like I haven't seen The Cobbler. I haven't
on Netflix or something.
Yeah. I haven't seen The Cobbler.
Definitely seen it. You said it was good.
Yeah.
So I don't fucking know.
Like I said, I feel like his role in like Funny People or Punch Drunk Mad Love are not. He's fine in them, but I don't think he's overly separated from his other persona. I wasn't like blown away or anything. Mm-hmm. And yet he's been this white whale that all these like super duper auteurs have been trying to get in their movies forever. Like Quentin Tarantino really wanted to play the Jew Bear, the Eli Roth part.
Inglourious Basterds.
Inglourious Basterds,
which that was a
Paul Thomas Anderson got him in, of course, Punch Drunk Love. Like those are the two biggest auteurs of that generation. Who else is in there?
No. Let me.
Like I'm trying to think. Like basically, his name has been floated around for like all these super like acclaimed movies in these important parts, like. If you just dive like Adam Sandler, like he was gonna be the villain in like 3, like he was. So Nolan wanted him to be one of the villains in the Batman movie at some point.
What?
Like him and Jim Carrey's the other one that's been floated around, but I feel like
solid.
Right, I feel like Jim Carrey has displayed much more of a range and has also like done more than like 3 of these. Like I feel like Jim Carrey does a serious movie like once every couple of years until he just became washed up in a weird anti-vaxxer. But
yeah.
But like prior to like Jim Carrey just falling off the deep end and going totally loco, I feel like people like Jim Carrey like actually like despite the fact that I think that Adam Sandler has shown like close to nothing, like everyone just is like gotta get Adam Sandler. Like no one wanted to work with him. Tarantino wanted to work with them. Paul Thomas Anderson did work with them.
Tom McCarthy directed The Cobbler. He's known for Good Night and Good Luck, The Wire. He directed a few episodes.
Oh yeah, I know who that is. Like yeah, that's
Meet the Parents.
He's a pretty big deal. So yeah, like another real pretty big name, like pretty like critically acclaimed name, and it's just really interesting to me that like what do people see in this guy? Obviously. It sort of ties into like maybe these people, whether it's Adam Sandler or like the one I always use, like Justin Bieber, despite the sort of just never showing their talent, the fact that they did make it in and of itself displays an underlying talent that oftentimes we as more critically attuned audiences don't necessarily notice, but that other people may notice just on a sort of primal surface level.
Well, that, and I'm wondering if, it has to do, like, I don't like Adam Sandler, but that's just me. Adam Sandler has an audience. There are people who will pick up, there are people who love Lil Nicky and Happy Gilmore and all those other movies, and I mean, you do you, I guess, but like, he has this audience for that kind of humor, and he has a star power attached to it, and so people will be like, ooh, an Adam Sandler movie, maybe I'll go watch it.
Right, well, all right, so there's kind of, there's two versions of the Adam Sandler, though. You've got, like, the ones you read, the Happy Gilmore, the Little Nicky, where it's like, in hindsight, these movies are not necessarily great, but they're, even if you don't like those movies, they're clearly a step way above what came afterwards. Like
they at least have the good graces to become memes,
So the different, like, Happy Gilmore has a functional plot and jokes that work. Like, even if you don't, like, I kind of like Happy Gilmore. I don't think it's not my favorite movie or anything, but, like, I'm not, like, openly offended by the existence of Happy Gilmore in the way I am, like, Jack and Jill.
Neither am I, but I'm not watching it.
Like, I eat pieces of shit like you for breakfast.
You eat pieces of shit for
breakfast? Like, that's a funny line. Like,
yeah, that's a solid
line. I guess, like, the difference is, like, the early Adam Sandler films, even if it was still sophomoric humor, there was, at least at time, there's a cleverness to it that Pixels has absolutely none of.
Yeah.
There's just a like, deeply...
Tom McCarthy directed Spotlight? Holy shit.
They knew!
I thought it was we knew, but okay. Don't scream that. It's past 9 o'clock. We share a wall.
They knew! Those bastards were raping children. I could have been one of those kids.
Who are you imitating right now?
Mark Ruffalo.
Mark Ruffalo.
They know.
My boy.
All right, I think that about wraps it up. I'm dead tired. I didn't have as many Adam Sandler thoughts as I thought I did, but that's all right. It didn't need to, a little coda to lighten up the mood. The moral of the story of this podcast, children, is that consumerism is not good, and having a more visceral, primal, in touch with nature experience in the world is better. Maybe, like...
I don't even necessarily believe that, but, just don't buy...
Live life. Don't buy life.
Actually, that's a pretty good byline, Just buying things doesn't make you happy, and I know that there's 1,000 Christmas movies that teach you that, but, like, it's... Just remember that if and when radical political reform comes and you're temporarily inconvenienced.
Yes. Rate, I'll probably just add an outro before but rate, review. Someday we'll be on iTunes, and just haven't got around to doing that.
Fuck iTunes. Fuck Apple. Free Hong Kong.
Free Hong Kong, yo.
Can we just, as long as the Hong Kong protests, I'm going to end it with Free Hong Kong.
Free Hong Kong, yo.